I rushed to the hospital after hearing my husband was in critical condition. Just as I reached his room, a nurse grabbed my hand and whispered, "Don't go in, hide." She pushed me behind the curtain of an empty ward. Through the small opening, I saw a woman walk in, and what she said to my husband made my knees tremble. Before I tell you what happened next, if you're watching this, please hit subscribe to her voice. Tell me in the comments which part shocked you the most and which country you're watching from. Hello, friends. My name is Mary. I am 58 years old and I live in Savannah, Georgia. This is the story of how a quiet life I loved turned into something that taught me the price of looking the other way. For 35 years, Richard and I were a team. We paid bills, we fixed a leaky roof, and we learned how to forgive small hurts. Over the last year, his laugh started to sound like someone else, and his excuses were always about work. He began to guard his phone like a secret and come home smelling like a place he did not want to tell me about. I wanted to trust him one more time, so I let pieces slide until one night a hospital call ripped everything open. They told me he was in critical condition, and I drove with my hands white on the wheel and my throat tight with prayer. When I burst into that hospital, a nurse I did not know grabbed my arm and pushed me behind a curtain and told me to hide. From the little slit, I watched as a woman walked into his room, dressed for a night out, not a hospital, and she leaned over him and said words that turned my whole life to ice. I could not hear every sentence, but I heard the line that mattered. "Once she is gone, we will be free." And he nodded. At that moment, the sound of years of trust collapsed inside me. I did not run into that room because the nurse looked at me like she had already lost something. If I made a scene, it would have made things worse. Instead, I walked out into the sunlight, pretending to be the same wife I had always been, and the sun felt like a lie that day. I stayed calm, but inside I began to build a plan. I watched Richard like a woman reads a map she hopes will lead her home, and I wrote everything down. Times, places, receipts, the little details that mean nothing to a lover, but everything to someone being betrayed. One afternoon, I found an insurance document in his briefcase with my name on it and a value that made my knees go soft. I sat on the kitchen floor and folded that paper into my hands and felt a shift in me. When Clara, the nurse, told me what she had overheard and offered to record their next meeting, my suspicion became proof, and my proof became fuel. Clara warned me to be careful, and I smiled and pretended to be small and grateful because nothing angers greedy people more than a person they think they have already buried. I did not scream. I did not storm out. I cooked his favorite dinner, and I touched his arm in public, and while he bragged in the other room, I sat with a pad and pen and planned. I went to my doctor and quietly asked him to check my pills, and when he told me someone had been tampering with them, I felt cold but steady because now the plot had edges I could grab. I could have run. I could have called the police and yelled until the neighborhood heard, but I chose another road because I wanted him and the woman with him to feel the slow collapse of everything they thought they had won. I learned that revenge in a house like ours is not fireworks and fury. It is patient work like a gardener pulling weeds so the roots come up whole. I opened accounts I did not tell him about. I sat with a lawyer and I made copies of documents, and I started to let small truths leak where they would be noticed. I placed quiet questions to people who like to gossip, and I smiled at the right times when they expected me to break down. At night, I sat on the back porch and listened to the ocean and thought about the woman I had been and the woman I was becoming. I promised myself I would not turn into someone cruel for cruelty's sake, but I also promised I would not be easy prey for two people who chose money over a marriage. The days blurred into routines where I was both careful and invisible, and that is a dangerous combination when a plan needs both patience and precision. I watched them slip where they thought they were clever, and I pulled the right strings at the right time. I planted doubts in conversations, and I let greedy habits reveal themselves without my interference. People who build schemes on lies tend to leave a trail of arrogance and small mistakes, and I started collecting those mistakes like coins. There were moments I ached and moments I felt fierce pride, and every choice carried weight. I wrote letters to myself that began with, "You will be okay," and ended with, "Remember to be careful," and those pages kept me steady. I will not lie and say the nights were easy or that I did not sometimes tremble with fear, but I also will not pretend I did not feel power as truth crept in and began to work. The next parts of this story are the pieces where the trap tightens, where greedy men and careless lovers begin to understand that they misjudged who they were dealing with. I am telling you this because the calm before the storm was the place I learned how to make a betrayal unravel without losing myself. And if you have ever loved someone and felt small, you will know that the first step toward getting up is to measure the ground and then put one foot forward. I woke up the next morning and the house felt heavier than it ever had before. I could still hear her voice echoing in my head, that woman standing over my husband, whispering words that cut through me like glass. I made coffee, but couldn't drink it. My hands were shaking too much, and I kept staring at the back door where he always came in whistling like life was simple. That day he came home from the hospital pretending nothing had happened. He said the doctor told him to rest and that he was lucky. I believed him. I smiled like a woman who knew nothing, but my eyes stayed cold. I watched his face as he ate the soup I made and wondered if he could feel that the warmth in our home had died. That night while he slept, I went through his phone. He had changed the password, but forgot one thing. He used the same pattern he used to unlock his old tablet. It took me 3 tries. When I got him, my heart stopped. There were messages from that woman. Her name was Angela. She sent him pictures of vacations she planned with him. Her words were full of promises that didn't belong to him anymore. The messages showed their affair had been going on for over a year. I read every one of them until my tears dried up and turned into something darker, something steady. I wanted to scream, but instead, I sat there in the dark room with only the sound of the clock ticking and whispered to myself, "You married a stranger." The next morning, I drove to the hospital again. I had to see Clara, the nurse who had warned me. She was sitting in the break room when I walked in, and the moment she saw my face, she understood. I told her everything, and she listened like someone who had seen too much pain. She told me Angela wasn't just any woman. She was the daughter of a man Richard once worked with, and that family had money, more money than us. She said Angela was using Richard to get access to his company shares. That made sense because he had been trying to sell part of the property that used to belong to my parents. I realized they were planning to take everything from me, even the house I had built with my own hands. I left the hospital with my chest burning. I knew now this wasn't just betrayal. It was a setup for something much bigger. I needed proof, something that would destroy both of them without me ever raising my voice. So I started collecting pieces. I began checking his bank statements, the hidden emails, the calls at odd hours. He thought I was sleeping, but I was watching. I found an account under a name I didn't recognize, and the moment I traced it back, I saw transfers matching the hospital dates. He was pretending to be sick while moving money out of our joint savings. I printed every record and hid them in a box under the garden shed. Every night I went to bed beside him, pretending to be tired, pretending to be the woman he thought he had fooled. I let him believe he was winning because that belief was my weapon. In small towns like Savannah, people talk, so I visited the hair salon more often, started chatting at the grocery store. I let it slip that Richard was having some business troubles, nothing big, just enough to make people curious. When you plant small rumors in the right ears, they grow fast. He noticed people treating him differently and started getting nervous, which made him careless. One night he forgot his briefcase in the living room. I opened it and found papers about life insurance. He had increased my policy amount without telling me. That's when I realized they had planned to make my death look natural, maybe an accident, maybe poison. I felt my skin crawl when I thought about how close I had been to trusting him again. I didn't cry that night. Instead, I sat outside on the porch with a candle and a glass of water. I watched the moon and thought about my mother. She always said, never let evil see your fear. I decided then that I would let them finish their plan, but on my terms. I called Clara and asked her to record every conversation she could between them. She agreed. She said she wanted to help because she had seen too many women broken by lies. Within 2 weeks, she sent me an audio file. The moment I played it, my stomach turned. I heard Richard laughing with Angela, talking about how they would be free soon, how the papers were ready, how the house would be sold the moment I was gone. I sat in silence, listening to my husband's voice plotting my end. The betrayal felt like a storm, but underneath it, something inside me woke up, a calm I had never known before. I decided I would give them exactly what they wanted, a death, but not mine. I spent days planning. I went to the lawyer secretly and changed my will, leaving everything not to Richard, but to a trust in my niece's name, one he couldn't touch until after my passing. And I told Richard I was feeling weak, that the stress was too much. He smiled with sympathy, but his eyes told another story. He started preparing my meals again. He insisted on making my tea every night, and I let him because I needed that last piece of proof. I took the cup to the lab with the help of Clara. The results came back showing traces of a slow-acting poison. He was trying to kill me slowly, carefully, pretending to care while I faded away. What he didn't know was that I'd stopped drinking his tea days ago, replacing it with a different cup that looked exactly the same. When a doctor called me and said my health was improving, I felt an invisible victory. I began to act weaker to make him think his plan was working. Meanwhile, Clara helped me send anonymous tips to the insurance company about fraudulent activity connected to my husband's policy. We let the trap grow bigger. I wanted them to feel safe before I pulled the ground from under them. Angela began visiting our house during the day, pretending to be a friend. She brought flowers, smiled at neighbors, acted innocent. I wanted her to get comfortable because comfort makes people stupid. One afternoon while they were together in the study, I placed my phone behind the curtain, recording everything. I heard her say, "Soon we'll have the money and we'll go to Miami. It's all set." My heart beat slow and steady like a drum. I had all the proof I needed. I transferred copies of every document and recording to my lawyer and waited. I knew the next step had to be perfect. If I rushed, they'd slip away. If I hesitated, they might act first. Patience was my best friend. That night, when Richard came to bed, he kissed my forehead and said, "We'll go on a trip soon, somewhere peaceful." I smiled in the dark and thought, "Yes, Richard, very soon, somewhere peaceful where you'll finally meet the truth." I closed my eyes and felt the weight of everything I had held inside for months. But instead of breaking, I felt stronger, the kind of strength that comes when pain burns, everything falls away, and what remains is pure steel. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was quiet and the air heavy. I could feel the tension from the night before lingering like a thick fog. Richard had left a note on the kitchen counter saying he had an early meeting, and Angela's car was gone too. I walked slowly through the house, pretending to tidy up, but really I was scanning every detail, checking for anything I might have missed. Every picture on the wall, every note left behind, every corner of this house that had once been our sanctuary now felt like a battlefield. I poured myself coffee and sat by the window, thinking about the plan I had been setting in motion. Months of collecting evidence, planting doubts, recording conversations. And now it was all starting to feel like a trap that could snap closed at any moment. I reminded myself not to rush, to let them become overconfident, to let them believe they had already won. Overconfidence is the fatal flaw of greed, and I intended to use it against them. By mid-morning, I got a call from Clara, her voice low and urgent. "Mary," she whispered, "they're meeting at the marina today. Richard and Angela, they're planning something. I need you to hear this." My pulse quickened, but I remained calm. I told her I would be there and hung up without a word. I grabbed my jacket and keys and drove slowly to the marina, keeping my eyes on the parking lot, noticing their car parked near the edge. Richard leaning against the hood, Angela laughing in a way that made my stomach twist. I parked a few spaces away and stayed in the car, recording the conversation from my phone hidden on the passenger seat. I could hear every word, every tone, every little laugh that revealed their arrogance. Angela said, "Soon the house will be ours." And Richard agreed, saying Mary never suspected a thing. She'd trust me completely. I almost laughed out loud behind my closed teeth. I stayed in the car for hours, listening, taking mental notes of their plans, and realized the depth of their betrayal was far worse than I imagined. They were not just after money. They were planning to manipulate the house sale, the insurance, and even contacts in the city to make sure my name disappeared from every record. I left the marina quietly before they saw me, driving back to the house thinking about my next move. That night, I prepared dinner as usual, keeping my demeanor light and cheerful. I smiled as Richard commented that the soup tasted perfect. All the while, I was already imagining how I would turn their plan upside down. I placed the files I had gathered in my safe, double-checking that every piece of evidence was secure and copied. Nothing could go wrong now. I called my lawyer and told him to prepare statements that would activate if anything happened to me unexpectedly. I smiled at him over the phone, telling him I would explain later, while inside I felt a surge of anticipation. I started leaving small hints around the house, casual remarks about money transfers, odd questions about the insurance policy, and Richard reacted exactly as I expected. Tightening his face, glancing at Angela, who tried to laugh it off but fidgeted nervously. I saw the cracks forming, their composure starting to unravel, and I felt a satisfaction that was both sweet and terrifying. Over the next few days, I continued my routine, acting weaker than I felt, pretending to need help with small tasks, giving them the illusion of control, all while strategically leaking pieces of evidence to people I trusted outside the house. By the fifth day, Angela was slipping up, leaving her phone unattended, forgetting to delete messages, even speaking aloud in ways that confirmed my suspicions. Richard grew more nervous, pacing, checking his phone constantly, and I watched quietly, taking notes for what would come next. I knew I had to strike at the right moment. The timing had to be perfect. One wrong move, and they could change everything. Then one evening, while Richard was in the study and Angela was upstairs, I opened the audio recording from the marina, replaying their voices, hearing their arrogance, and realized I had enough proof to destroy them completely. I packaged the files discreetly and left them in a courier envelope addressed to my lawyer with instructions for immediate action if anything happened to me. The next morning, I pretended to sleep in while Richard and Angela plotted again in the living room. I heard them whispering about the house, the insurance, and how quickly things would move once I was gone. I stayed in bed, pretending to nap, listening to every word, letting my anger simmer quietly beneath the surface. I knew the moment I revealed my knowledge would be devastating. It had to come when they felt untouchable, when they thought their plan was foolproof. I took mental notes of their schedules, planned my next movements carefully, and realized how predictable greed made them. Later that day, I called Clara and told her to be ready to act if necessary. We had coordinated a backup plan to ensure I could move quickly if they tried anything sudden. By evening, I prepared my tea as usual, adding nothing suspicious, but making sure every detail of the house was in place, my nerves calm, my mind sharp. When Richard brought it to me, I sipped slowly, maintaining my act. While inside, I plotted exactly how I would turn their arrogance into their downfall. Over the next few days, I escalated subtly, leading more hints of my knowledge around the house, observing how they reacted to small pressures and taking careful notes. Angela became careless, leaving messages visible. Richard grew paranoid, questioning every move. The web I had woven around them was closing slowly but efficiently. I spent hours each night reviewing recordings, printed documents, and cross-checking everything with Clara to make sure nothing was missing. I even arranged small meetings with neighbors who had previously noticed Angela's strange behavior, feeding them subtle cues to ensure that when the time came, the revelations would have impact. I felt the weight of months of planning and betrayal, but also a strange clarity knowing that every step I had taken was deliberate and precise. I watched them believing they were untouchable, knowing that the trap was almost complete, their downfall imminent. By the end of the week, I had every single piece of proof I could need. I had the legal support, I had witnesses, and I had the calm confidence of a woman who had been betrayed but refused to break. The next move was mine, and I knew the moment would be perfect. Richard and Angela could not escape what was coming. The plan was set, the trap ready, and I could finally breathe knowing that the storm I had prepared was about to begin. I had spent weeks building a quiet trap, and now the day to tighten it had come. I kept acting fragile, while inside I felt composed and steady. Richard and Angela had grown careless because they believed my weakness was real. I let them live in that belief like mice in a walled garden. My niece Emma agreed to help, and she drove up from Charleston early in the morning. She moved through the house like a shadow and left nothing to chance. I dressed in soft cotton and moved slowly so neighbors would assume I was failing. I left notes that suggested a foggy mind, and I mentioned doctor appointments casually to friends. Those small signals were the bait I needed to shape their confidence into arrogance. At noon, I walked to the market and spoke loudly about medication changes so people would overhear. When I returned home, Richard was talking about closing a deal, and he was laughing in a way that sounded like victory. I sat at the table and pretended to be listless while watching every detail of their faces. Clara texted and told me she had a set of files ready to forget at her station. and she planned to bring them that afternoon. I felt the plan's edges fit into place with a cold satisfaction. At 3, Emma slipped a flash drive into my pocket disguised as a camera memory card. It felt like a heartbeat against my thigh, and I held it there like a promise. Inside that drive were banking records and messages that tied Richard and Angela to the offshore account I had been tracing. I kept those files in the safe until the right moment to introduce them into daylight. In the afternoon, I called my lawyer and used a weak, shaking voice I had practiced to ask him to stop by right away. He arrived calmly and with patience, and that calm looked like more evidence to the people watching. I asked neighbors to drop by as if for tea, and a witness was never a bad idea. When Angela arrived, she wore a perfume that filled the room with an arrogance I recognized. She hugged me theatrically, and Richard brought in a bouquet that had been chosen to look spontaneous. They believed the script they were living in was unassailable. Clara came in carrying a stack of misplaced documents from the hospital, and she handed them to Angela as if it were casual. Angela opened the folder and skimmed the first page with the confidence of someone who saw no threat. The first pages contained billing records that revealed fake consultations and inflated charges tied to Richard's name. Angela faltered and turned pale, and I saw the moment the mask slipped from her face. Richard rose to his feet and tried to claim the papers were forged and that anyone could plant files. He sounded small and hurried, and I realized how fragile their performance was when observed. I let the room fill with the rhythm of accusation and disbelief, and it worked like a slow current weakening a dam. My neighbor, Mrs. Collins, mentioned deliveries to their house and a pattern she had noticed, and the remark landed with the weight of community memory. Emma stood and dropped the flash drive onto the coffee table, an act so simple that it felt like thunder. The lawyer asked to see the files, and he produced matching subpoenas and records he had already prepared. The insurance investigator who had arrived because of the anonymous tip produced bank statements that mirrored what I had found. At that moment, the room contracted into a clear, sharp reality where lies could no longer hide. Angela tried to leave, and Richard reached for her hand, but the hand slipped away like guilt escaping containment. Well, police were called and questions were asked, and for the first time in months, I watched the men who had planned my end scramble without the script they had written. I sat quietly breathing, like someone detached from a storm who had watched the lightning arc but remained untouched. When officers led Richard to the cruiser, he looked at me as if pleading for a private mercy I would not grant. He had traded a lifetime of truth for a sliver of profit, and that was his undoing. Angela was found in her car with texts that confirmed plans to transfer funds once the policy paid out. The town that had whispered about my sorrow now whispered about the scandal, and their voices were no longer pitying, but sharp with new curiosity. I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and relief, and for the first time, I allowed myself to feel anything but anger. I thought of my mother and the lessons she gave me about silence and steadiness, and I understood that quiet had been my weapon all along. That night, I sat with Emma and Clara on the back porch, and we watched the stars as if nothing had happened, but everything had changed. We spoke in low voices about next steps, about lawyers and trials, and about how to protect the house and what it meant to be free from the shadow of betrayal. I knew there would be months of courtrooms and private meetings and long nights of paper and argument, but the first strike had been carefully aimed and it had hit the mark. I made a list of people who could testify, and I prepared copies of everything in triplicate, because proof is a language the greedy understand. I did not celebrate. I simply breathed and let the night be the quiet aftermath of a storm I had called down deliberately. In the days that followed, neighbors who had once offered condolences now brought casseroles with a hesitant respect, and the tone of conversations shifted. Richard called me from a holding cell, and his voice sounded smaller than it had, and I listened and kept my responses precise and minimal. Angela posted a short apology online, but the message read like an actor reading lines, and it did not persuade anyone who knew the truth. My son Ethan arrived from Atlanta and hugged me, and for the first time I felt the full circle of family gathering around the woman they thought they had lost. He held my hand and said, "Mother, we will fix this." And his words were simple and fierce, and I let myself believe him for a moment. I had not wanted revenge to become something that swallowed me whole, and seeing my family aligned behind me felt like a remedy. Clara and the lawyer worked through evidence, and I sat in hearings, providing calm testimony and watching how the wheels of justice began to turn. At times, patience felt like an old friend, and at times it felt like a long road, but each day I woke determined to be more than the target they once planned me to be. I learned that power can be quiet and that dignity can be a force that repels cruelty more effectively than rage. The trap I had built had not only exposed greed, it had also shown me the depth of my own courage, and for that alone I felt a measure of peace. Thought the days that followed were tense, but carefully controlled. I moved through my house like a shadow of calm, while Richard and Angela faced the consequences of their own arrogance. I spent mornings checking emails and bank statements, ensuring every record matched what I'd gathered before, and every discrepancy was a thread to pull them further apart. Clara continued to assist me, delivering updates from the hospital, monitoring Angela's movements, and helping me coordinate with the lawyer so every step would be precise and legally unassailable. My routine never faltered. I cooked meals, tended the garden, and smiled at neighbors while inside I felt a storm of satisfaction brewing. Angela had been temporarily banned from the house, and Richard's movements were restricted, but both were desperate to reclaim control, to rewrite what had already been exposed, and their desperation made them predictable. I used that predictability like a map, tracing where each would go, when, and how they would try to manipulate witnesses or evidence. Emma helped me archive documents, making duplicates, labeling every file, every recording with meticulous care. At night, I would sit on the porch, the breeze from the river carrying the faint scent of salt and magnolia, and I would think about the long months of planning, the betrayals I had endured, and the slow, deliberate path I had chosen to make sure justice would feel earned. One afternoon, Angela attempted to contact Richard through text messages, thinking she could convince him to act in her favor, and I intercepted them. I read every word, noting her desperation, her attempt to bribe him with promises of the insurance payout, and I realized her arrogance was still intact because she did not yet see the trap closing. I printed those messages and added them to the growing pile of proof, arranging them so any observer would see clearly the pattern of manipulation and greed. Richard tried to feign ignorance when confronted in small legal meetings, but the law works on evidence, and my evidence was undeniable, precise, and cruelly effective. I watched his face turn pale each time a document was read aloud or a recording played, the same face that had once smiled over my shoulder, the same man who had plotted my slow death, now shrinking under the weight of what he had done. Angela's expressions were more volatile. The arrogance she had carried like a shield melted into fear, anger, and a frantic need to explain herself. But explanations do not erase actions. I stayed silent through all of it, speaking only when necessary, letting my demeanor suggest fragility, while the power of the plan revealed itself without me raising my voice. That evening, I walked through the living room and saw the files spread across the table, Clara beside me, whispering notes about upcoming legal procedures, and I felt the satisfaction of knowing months of careful observation and planning were finally reaching fruition. Richard attempted to negotiate privately with his lawyer, offering concessions, promising changes, but the foundation had already crumbled, and I knew he understood it. Angela tried the same, calling friends and attempting to contact influential people, but each move was countered, recorded, and documented. I even visited neighbors, speaking casually about the strange behaviors I had witnessed, letting gossip act as another silent weapon. People began noticing discrepancies in their story, small oddities that created suspicion and doubt, which is exactly what I had intended. Emma and I created a timeline, plotting every lie and misstep against the evidence, ensuring nothing could be challenged or forgotten. The days blended into weeks, the tension constant but manageable, and I began to notice Richard's health declining, the stress of exposure, the fear of punishment, and the slow recognition that his entire plan had failed. Angela was frantic, making errors that compounded with every attempt to save herself, and the more desperate she became, the more effective the trap became. I found a strange calm in all of it, a rhythm of quiet power that was both satisfying and terrifying. The house felt like a theater where I had written the script and now watched the actors stumble over the lines they had written themselves. Friends who had supported me cautiously approached, bringing food and checking in, unaware that they were witnessing the final act of a drama that had started months earlier. I smiled and thanked them, allowing the normalcy to mask the storm of revenge that was unfolding. Each night, I reviewed evidence, listening to recordings, reading messages, and ensuring that no detail was overlooked. Clara and Emma were steady companions, silent and precise, reminding me of the discipline I had cultivated. The law was on my side, and the careful recording of months of deceit, manipulation, and plotting meant that nothing could escape scrutiny. One afternoon, while reviewing a new set of banking statements, I realized how deeply Richard had tried to hide his transactions, and I smiled, knowing that greed blinds people more than anything else. Each error he had made, each careless conversation, each arrogant smile had been collected and cataloged, and now it was impossible for them to wriggle free. I prepared the final package for the authorities, ensuring that it contained everything necessary to guarantee accountability. When it was finally delivered, I felt a strange sense of relief, a culmination of months of careful patience, observation. I did not celebrate in the traditional sense. I simply felt the weight of justice settling over me, knowing that the people who had intended my harm would face the consequences of their actions. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to rest, to sleep, without the tension of fear lurking in every corner. I walked through the house, noticing every small detail, the furniture, the photographs, the rooms that had once held memories of trust. And I felt a sense of reclamation, a quiet satisfaction that nothing they had done could take from me the life I had built or the dignity I had preserved. Richard and Angela were no longer figures of fear. They were symbols of the consequences of arrogance and greed. Emma hugged me one night as we looked at the stars from the back porch and whispered, "You did it." And I nodded, realizing that the true victory was not just exposing them, but reclaiming my life with careful patience and unyielding resolve. The trap had worked exactly as planned, and I had done it without raising my voice or losing my composure. I realized that power can be quiet, that patience can be lethal, and that dignity preserved is often the most potent weapon. The house felt lighter, the air fresher, and for the first time in months, I could breathe without fear. I had survived betrayal, plotted revenge, and emerged stronger, and I understood in that moment that the storm I had called down had not only punished them, but had revealed the depths of my own courage and resilience. I sat on the porch long after sunset, watching the stars, knowing the coming weeks would bring court proceedings and legal discussions, but the most dangerous and decisive moves had already been made. And I had won quietly, patiently, and completely. I spent the morning pretending to sort laundry, humming softly while noting every glance, every whisper, and every mistake they made. Angela had grown careless with her phone again, leaving it charging in the kitchen, and I made sure to collect the evidence without them noticing. Richard argued softly with Angela about who would control what if the sale went through, and I listened from the hallway, pretending to be distracted by the dishes. That afternoon, I invited Clara over, and she brought with her a recording device hidden inside a small decorative box. We placed it on the counter in plain view, but disguised so that Richard would think it was an old speaker. I watched Angela approach it and mutter something about its decoration, completely unaware that it was collecting every word. I had also prepared a small letter to be discovered by the authorities, detailing how their actions had escalated to attempted harm against me and included all copies of recordings and documents. By evening, Richard was more paranoid than I had ever seen him, pacing the study, muttering under his breath, and Angela was trying to calm him while clearly panicking herself. I poured myself a cup of tea, keeping my movements slow and deliberate, and I sipped quietly while watching the storm they had built for themselves. I smiled faintly, realizing that each small act of arrogance on their part had woven the net tighter around them. That night, I placed subtle hints around the house, notes suggesting that I was aware of even more than I had revealed. And I left small clues for neighbors who had been watching the situation unfold, knowing that rumors would spread like wildfire. Richard found one of the notes, his face twisting in disbelief, and Angela snatched it from him, reading it aloud and gasping when she realized that I documented months of their deceit. I sat quietly on the sofa, pretending to read, while inside I felt a cold satisfaction that was almost intoxicating. Clara texted me updates about recordings, and I knew that every word they spoke was being captured, creating an airtight case that even their lawyers could not dispute. Over the next few days, I continued to observe their routines, noting the patterns and anticipating their moves. I let them believe they were still in control, a mistake that made every step they took predictable and fraught with tension. One evening, I received a call from my lawyer saying that the insurance company had started an internal investigation based on the evidence we had submitted, and I felt a surge of triumph. I moved through the house with careful calm, making it seem like nothing had changed, while inside I was plotting the moment to reveal the full truth. I arranged a small dinner, inviting a few key neighbors and witnesses under the guise of a casual gathering, and I watched Richard and Angela walk in, unaware that they were walking into a room filled with people who knew pieces of the story. I poured wine and served dishes as I had practiced, maintaining a soft smile while my mind cataloged every reaction. Angela tried to act confident, but her eyes betrayed the panic she was feeling, and Richard's hand trembled slightly as he held his glass. I let them settle into their seats and began casual conversation, allowing the tension to build naturally, then subtly dropped a comment about recent changes to my will and financial arrangements, watching as their faces shifted in real-time panic. The neighbors exchanged glances, their curiosity growing, and I could see the realization dawning on Richard and Angela that the game they had played so recklessly was about to end. I excused myself briefly and retrieved a folder from the study, returning to the table and placing it gently in front of the lawyer who had accompanied me. He opened it and began summarizing the evidence, recording transcripts, banking irregularities, and proof of attempts to manipulate insurance and property. And I watched Angela's composure shatter completely. Richard tried to interject, saying the documents were forged, but the lawyer calmly presented notarized copies, recordings, and corroborating witness statements. The room was heavy with tension, and I felt a strange thrill, knowing that every detail had been anticipated and accounted for. Angela's voice rose in panic, trying to explain, to charm, to rationalize her actions, but no one listened. Richard looked at me, his face pale and tight with fear, and I met his gaze evenly, letting the cold clarity in my eyes speak louder than any words I could utter. I remained calm and collected, sipping my tea while the lawyer outlined how every action they had taken to betray and harm me had been meticulously documented. The neighbors began asking questions, curious and sharp, and I let them guide the conversation naturally, allowing the exposure to unfold organically. Clara discreetly handed me another set of files containing messages that Richard and Angela had thought were deleted, and I added them to the evidence already being discussed. Angela began shaking, whispering frantically to Richard, realizing that nothing could save them now. Richard's usual confidence had evaporated, replaced with the same panic and disbelief I had seen in the hospital months before when the truth first started unfolding. The courtroom was quiet when we arrived, the kind of silence that presses on your chest and makes your heart beat loud. I walked slowly, my dress flowing gently, keeping my composure while inside my mind cataloged every word, every reaction I would need to observe. Richard and Angela sat across from me, their faces pale and tight, their arrogance long gone, replaced with tension and quiet panic. I smiled faintly, just enough to let them know I was calm, untouchable, and fully aware of every deceit they had orchestrated. The judge entered, and the room seemed to shrink under the weight of impending judgment. I presented the evidence systematically, each document, each recording, each witness statement building a mountain of proof that left them no escape. Richard tried to interject, claiming perjury or misunderstanding, but the lawyer countered every point with notarized records, banking statements, and testimonies from neighbors who had noticed suspicious activity. Angela's hand shook as she tried to follow along, muttering excuses under her breath, but every word only seemed to entangle her further. I felt a strange, calm satisfaction as the reality of exposure unfolded. Every secret lay bare in front of the courtroom. The prosecutor walked through the timeline I had meticulously documented, showing months of deception, manipulation, and attempts to harm me, and I watched as the color drained from their faces. Richard's usual confident smirk was gone, replaced with a tight jaw and eyes darting around, calculating but too late. I kept my posture straight, my hands folded, calmly, projecting the aura of someone who had been patient for months and now held absolute control. Outside, the whispers of neighbors who had attended or heard about the trial spread through Savannah, making the story grow faster than I could have imagined. The defense struggled, presenting flimsy explanations that contradicted evidence. And the more they spoke, the more clearly the jury could see the pattern of greed and betrayal. I had made sure that every recording, every message, every witness statement aligned perfectly, and it was impossible to refute the consistency of months of meticulous planning. Angela's voice cracked as she tried to explain away financial transactions, and I realized that panic, not guilt, had replaced her arrogance. Richard shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his tie, attempting to look collected, but the weight of exposure was visible in every gesture. I had spent months orchestrating this, and now the silent satisfaction of watching their empire of lies collapse was almost intoxicating. The judge called for a short recess, and I stepped outside briefly, breathing in the crisp Georgia air, letting the tension of the courtroom wash over me without touching my composure. Emma and Clara waited nearby, their presence a quiet support, and I felt the steady reassurance of allies who had helped me ensure the plan worked flawlessly. During recess, neighbors approached, some whispering congratulations, others cautiously asking questions about the outcome. And I replied gently, keeping details minimal, letting the process unfold naturally. When we returned, the courtroom resumed, and the prosecutor revealed the final piece of evidence, a set of texts and emails that Angela had assumed deleted, but were recovered through backups and forensic methods. The evidence showed clear collusion, planning, and malicious intent toward me, and the jury's expressions shifted from curiosity to shock as the depth of betrayal became undeniable. Richard's shoulders slumped, and he looked at Angela, who tried desperately to maintain eye contact but failed. I observed everything quietly, every facial expression, a confirmation that the months of planning, patience, and observation had paid off. The final arguments were delivered, emphasizing not just financial misconduct, but the deliberate intent to harm and manipulate me, and I felt the weight of my own triumph settle in. Outside the courtroom, the air felt lighter, as though the exposure of truth had lifted an invisible burden from the streets themselves. Weeks later, the verdict was announced. Both Richard and Angela were held accountable, facing restrictions, fines, and legal repercussions that would prevent them from harming anyone else in the same way. I listened quietly, taking notes, observing their reactions, and feeling the satisfaction of justice measured and complete. I returned home to the house I had fought to protect, walking through each room slowly, touching familiar surfaces, and allowing myself a moment to breathe without the weight of constant vigilance. Clara and Emma were there, and together we sat quietly in the living room, processing the whirlwind of months, the intensity of the courtroom, and the relief of seeing justice delivered without resorting to rash action. I reflected on the months of planning, the careful patience, and the quiet strength that had guided me, understanding that true power lies not in anger, but in composure and foresight. The neighborhood, once whispering about scandal, began to see a different story. A woman who had been betrayed, but had responded with dignity, intelligence, and unwavering strength. I felt a profound sense of reclamation as I looked around my home, knowing that the life I had built, the relationships I had nurtured, and the justice I had earned were intact. Weeks later, I began reconnecting with friends and neighbors, attending small gatherings and allowing my presence to return to normalcy, but always with the quiet awareness of the strength I had cultivated. The house, once heavy with tension and fear, felt alive again, filled with light and the simple rhythms of daily life. Emma visited frequently, bringing laughter and warmth, and Clara continued to support with practical assistance, ensuring that no loose ends threatened the peace we had restored. I reflected on the months of careful observation, the small victories, and the ultimate exposure of greed and betrayal, and I understood the importance of patience and precision. Richard and Angela were still legally constrained, their freedom limited, their plans destroyed. And I had achieved all of this without compromising my own integrity or giving in to uncontrolled anger. I walked through the garden in the late afternoons, letting the sun cast long shadows across the lawn, and thought about how quietly effective strategy can reshape the course of events, how careful observation allows for leverage over those who assume control. The air felt lighter than it had in years, carrying with it the faint scent of magnolia and salt from the nearby river, a reminder that life moves forward even after storms of betrayal. I spent time organizing the house, arranging documents, and maintaining meticulous records, not out of obsession, but to ensure that the hard-won stability was preserved and that no resurgence of deceit could threaten the life I had reclaimed. Neighbors began to ask subtle questions, curious about my calm demeanor, and I answered softly, letting my composure speak louder than any narrative I could provide. Each evening I sat with Emma or Clara, sharing quiet conversations about life, family, and the importance of resilience, and I felt the subtle joy of normalcy returning. Over time, the town's whispers shifted from scandal to admiration, seeing a woman who had been wronged but had responded with intelligent strategy and unshakable patience. I reflected on my journey, realizing that every moment of betrayal, every secret, and every calculated observation had been necessary to reach the moment of complete restoration. I understood that revenge is not about destruction alone, but about reclaiming dignity and ensuring that truth prevails. As the final court rulings were enforced, Richard and Angela faced ongoing consequences that would prevent future manipulation, and I felt the quiet satisfaction of justice served with precision. The house, the family, and my personal peace had been preserved, and the months of careful planning had transformed fear into empowerment. I realized that strength often manifests quietly in careful steps, in patience, in observation, and in the ability to act decisively when the moment is right. Walking through the familiar halls, touching the familiar furniture, and breathing the calm air of my home, I allowed myself to feel the depth of relief and accomplishment, knowing that betrayal had been confronted, deceit exposed, and justice served in the most complete way possible. I had survived, planned, and executed my revenge, not with reckless emotion, but with measured, precise action. And the town of Savannah now witnessed a woman who had endured and emerged stronger, wiser, and unbroken. The dust from the courtroom had barely settled, yet the tension in the air remained palpable. I moved through my home with a quiet vigilance, pretending daily life had returned to normal, while inside I was aware that Richard and Angela were counting every move I made, anticipating weakness that would never come. I poured myself tea slowly, the steam rising like a thin veil between me and the chaos they had tried to orchestrate. And I reflected on the months of betrayal that had led to this moment, realizing how patient observation, careful planning, and unshakable composure had become my most potent weapons. Emma visited frequently, sharing updates and quiet laughter, and Clara continued her subtle support, reminding me that allies are often as crucial as strategy when confronting greed and deceit. Richard had begun making small mistakes in private meetings, thinking he could manipulate new evidence, but each step he took only confirmed the meticulous nature of my preparation. Angela tried to contact influential acquaintances again, but every move was recorded, every attempt anticipated, and I allowed their desperation to grow without comment, savoring the knowledge that control had shifted firmly to me. One evening, while arranging documents and reviewing recordings, I realized that the final exposure could be dramatic, public, and undeniable. And I planned a small gathering with key witnesses, neighbors, and legal counsel to ensure that the moment of reckoning would have maximum effect. The day arrived, and I moved through my house with deliberate calm, greeting neighbors with soft smiles and casual words, masking the storm about to unfold behind measured gestures. Richard and Angela arrived, their faces pale, their arrogance replaced with the tight, panicked expressions of those who understand they are powerless. And I welcomed them with calm courtesy, pouring tea and maintaining a composed demeanor that contrasted sharply with the chaos I had orchestrated. Clara discreetly positioned files and recordings, while Emma subtly arranged witnesses in positions that would observe without being obvious. And I felt the thrill of control as I sipped my tea, every detail in place. I began casually asking Richard questions about the property, the insurance, and the months of transactions that had occurred, letting the conversation flow naturally while my hidden observers noted every sign of discomfort and guilt. Angela tried to interject with charm, her voice shaky, attempting to redirect attention and assert control, but the evidence I revealed at strategic moments cut through every lie, every excuse, and left them grasping at thin air. I introduced recordings of their plotting, emails that proved collusion, and documents that mapped the entire web of deceit, and the reactions were immediate. Angela's hands trembled as she fumbled through her purse. Richard's voice faltered when he realized the full weight of exposure, and I remained calm, my composure unshakable. The neighbors leaned in, whispering to each other, their curiosity piqued, and the social pressure amplified the impact of every revelation, creating a collective understanding of the depth of betrayal. Clara and Emma ensured that everything ran smoothly, handing me additional evidence as needed. all while maintaining the appearance of casual presence, and I orchestrated the unfolding drama like a conductor guiding an orchestra. By evening, both Richard and Angela were cornered, their options exhausted, their attempts at denial feeble and transparent, and I felt the satisfaction of justice unfolding naturally, without force, without anger, only the precise alignment of preparation and timing. I allowed them a final moment of silent comprehension before quietly inviting my lawyer to explain the legal consequences in full, and the weight of their actions became undeniable. Every misstep documented, every lie exposed. The neighbors left slowly, whispering about the drama, and I felt a quiet thrill in knowing that the social acknowledgement of truth had been achieved alongside legal accountability. That night, I sat on the back porch with Emma and Clara, watching the stars reflected in the calm river, reflecting on the months of preparation, betrayal, and revenge. And I understood that the power of patience, observation, and strategic action had allowed me to reclaim control without losing myself to anger. The house, once heavy with tension and fear, now felt alive again, filled with light, laughter, and the quiet satisfaction of restored dignity. Over the next few weeks, I continued to monitor the situation, ensuring compliance with legal rulings while also reestablishing normal routines, reconnecting with friends, and allowing myself moments of genuine joy and relaxation. I realized that true revenge is not in immediate destruction, but in the careful orchestration of circumstances that reveal the truth fully, leaving no room for denial or escape. Richard and Angela's influence was broken, their manipulations exposed, and I had demonstrated that patience, intelligence, and composure are far more powerful than rage or impulsive action. Life began to return to a quieter rhythm, the legal system processing consequences, the house resuming its role as a sanctuary rather than a battlefield. And I took time to appreciate small victories, morning coffee by the window, and the simple laughter of Emma and Clara in the kitchen. I reflected on the months of fear, deception, and plotting, realizing that the strength I had cultivated was not just for revenge, but for reclaiming peace, protecting loved ones, and asserting the dignity that had been threatened. I maintained contact with neighbors, subtly confirming that all was proceeding as planned, and observed Richard and Angela's continued frustration from a distance, knowing they were bound by the legal framework I had helped create. I allowed myself private moments of reflection, acknowledging that the road had been long and emotionally taxing, yet every step had reinforced the value of strategy, patience, and resilience. Each night, I walked the halls of my home, touching familiar surfaces, listening to the quiet hum of life restored, and felt the profound satisfaction of reclaiming what had almost been taken. I journaled quietly, recording the timeline, the lessons learned, and the personal growth achieved, ensuring that my own experience would be preserved as a testament to endurance and careful planning. The final resolutions were in place, both Richard and Angela facing the full consequences of their actions, their plans dismantled, and the court rulings confirming that justice had been measured and effective. I sat quietly in the living room, reflecting on the journey, the betrayal endured, and the precise execution of revenge that had restored balance to my life. Emma and Clara joined me, and we shared a simple meal, laughter, and conversation, allowing the first real sense of normalcy in months to settle in. I understood fully that the power I had exercised was not in brute force, but in patient observation, calculated action, and unwavering composure. And that realization brought a peace deeper than any moment of anger could have provided. I revisited old memories in the house, recalling moments of fear, doubt, and sadness, and felt a profound sense of closure, knowing that I had reclaimed not just property or control, but the emotional and moral authority that had been challenged. As the sun set over Savannah, the river glowing faintly, I allowed myself a rare moment to breathe, appreciating the quiet strength that had carried me through months of deception, betrayal, and calculated action. The city whispered around me, stories circulating quietly about the woman who had endured, observed, and executed justice with calm precision, and I felt the satisfaction of seeing reputation, integrity, and dignity fully restored. My life began to settle into a rhythm of peace, punctuated by the occasional reflection on how easily trust can be broken, how carefully strength must be cultivated, and how deliberate action can achieve justice without succumbing to uncontrolled emotion. I had survived, planned, executed, and emerged stronger, and that realization gave me a quiet, enduring satisfaction. I sat with Emma and Clara on the back porch one last time, watching the stars and listening to the soft sounds of Savannah at night, reflecting on the storm I had weathered, and the calm that now followed. I knew the road ahead was still real and full of responsibilities, but the critical battles had been won, the betrayal addressed, and the life I cherished preserved. I took a final breath, feeling the weight of months lift, and whispered to myself that patience, courage, and precision had not only delivered justice, but had reaffirmed the dignity of a life that would continue with strength, clarity, and quiet triumph.
Thank you for watching this story, friends.
If you enjoyed following Mary's journey and her careful, patient, and ultimately satisfying revenge, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story of courage, cunning, and unexpected justice. Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us which part shocked you the most. And remember, the next story will be just as thrilling, emotional, and unforgettable.